Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that, well, touches every single one of us in some way. Human suffering. And we're looking at it through a really fresh and honestly fascinating angle, the perspective that artificial intelligence is starting to offer.
Right.
So if you're curious about this complex part of being human, but maybe you want to grasp the core ideas without getting totally bogged down, you're definitely in the right place.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, our main source is a really comprehensive piece. It's called AI and the Labyrinth of Human Suffering.
Labyrinth. Sounds about right.
It really is. And it's this fascinating blend of ideas, It pulls insights from psychology, philosophy, biology, sociology, history, and of course the rapidly evolving world of AI itself.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this labyrinth then. Our goal today really is to pull out the most important insights.
Yeah.
We want to understand what suffering actually is, how we experience it, the different forms it takes, where it comes from biologically, evolutionarily, how thinkers have wrestled with it for centuries.
All the big questions.
Exactly. And its deep roots in our societies, our history. And then finally, what happens when we throw AI into this already incredibly intricate picture.
It adds a whole new layer.
Definitely.
Right.
So get ready for maybe some surprising connections and hopefully ideas that will get you thinking.
Okay, so let's maybe lay some groundwork first. Our source defines human suffering as this really complex mix. It's pain, distress, general discomfort.
Right.
And it's crucial to get that this isn't just about physical stuff. It includes those really profound emotional and mental states we all know. Things like grief, the impact of trauma, illness, even that fundamental unease, just thinking about existence.
Yeah.
Existential angst.
Yeah, it's interesting how the source points out that suffering isn't some kind of error in the system, is it?
No, not at all.
It's actually presented as a core part of being human. It's kind of woven into the fabric of our lives through loss, conflict, illness. I mean, the whole human experience, really.
Exactly. And pain, which is often the trigger for so much suffering, it has this really vital biological job.
The alarm system.
Precisely. It's like our body's alarm saying, hey, pay attention, something's not right here. It motivates us, warns us of danger.
Without it, we'd be in serious trouble.
Oh, absolutely. Think about those rare conditions where people can't feel pain. They often end up with severe injuries they don't even notice. But here's where it gets really interesting. That very usefulness of pain, its protective function, is also what makes it a primary source of our distress.
Ah, so it's a double-edged sword.
It is. There's this inherent tension right at the heart of suffering.
And the source really hammers home the difference between pain and suffering, doesn't it? Which seems key, especially thinking about AI.
Totally key. Pain feels more like that immediate sensory or emotional reaction. You touch a hot stove, you feel pain.
Right, the stimulus and response.
Yeah. Suffering, though, is what happens when our minds get involved. It's how we interpret the pain, the meaning we assign to it, that lingering anguish, the story we tell ourselves about it.
So AI might detect pain signals.
It could, yeah. Even respond in a programmed way, but truly grasping those deeply personal, meaning-filled layers of human suffering, that's a whole different ballgame.
A much bigger challenge.
A much bigger challenge. And as the source emphasizes, pain has this dual potential. It can push us to make positive changes, avoid danger, but it can also, unfortunately, lead to feelings of desperation and helplessness.
Okay. So now let's look at how suffering actually shows up in our lives. The source walks us through some key examples, starting with grief and loss.
Yeah, something universal. We all face it when we lose someone or something we deeply care about. And it's that whole spectrum of feelings, isn't it? Intense sadness, anger, confusion, maybe even relief sometimes.
Then there's trauma. The source describes that as, well, as long-lasting wounds on our mental well-being.
Right. Wounds that can fundamentally change how we think, how we feel, how we interact with the world. Trauma can really shatter our core assumptions about being safe, about the world being predictable.
And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's one specific way trauma can manifest. With those recurring unwanted memories. The tendency to avoid anything that reminds you of the event.
Yeah, they avoid
those negative shifts in mood and how you think, and that feeling of being constantly on edge, hyper-aroused.
But the source makes a really crucial point here. How trauma affects each of us isn't uniform. It's not the same for everyone.
Right.
It depends on so many factors. Who we are as individuals, our prior experiences, the specific nature of the event, how severe it was.
Your age at the time, too.
Your age, absolutely. The meaning you make of it afterwards, and even the cultural context you're embedded in, all of that shapes the response.
What's interesting, though, is that the source points out that our initial reactions to trauma, feeling exhausted, maybe confused, sad, anxious, those are actually natural responses.
They are. They can be adaptive in the short term. And it's so important to remember, as the source highlights, that many, many survivors of trauma show incredible strength and resilience in the long run.
That's a vital point.
It really is. Moving beyond trauma, the source also touches on anxiety, that persistent feeling of unease, fear, worry, often with physical symptoms.
Yeah, the racing heart, the tense muscles.
Exactly. And depression, characterized by that ongoing sadness, loss of interest or pleasure in things, feelings of guilt or hopelessness, plus the physical aspects like changes in sleep or appetite, fatigue, trouble concentrating, and in severe cases, even suicidal thoughts.
And then there's existential angst. That feels different again.
It does. It's that really deep unease that arises when we grapple with those fundamental questions of existence.
Why are we here? What does freedom mean? Death.
Our place in the cosmos. All the big, heavy stuff. It's the philosophical weight of being a conscious human being.
So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the source makes this really important distinction between those temporary adaptive responses to hard times.
Like feeling down after a setback.
Right, and conditions that become chronic, debilitating, really interfering with life.
Yeah, and this distinction is so relevant when we think about AI and mental health, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We need AI systems smart enough to avoid, over-pathologizing normal human distress.
Labeling everything as a disorder.
Exactly. While also being able to accurately identify when someone genuinely needs professional support. That's a fine line to walk.
A very fine line. Okay, so we know suffering is universal, but the source really digs into how it's experienced differently across various groups. Let's start with gender.
Okay. The source notes that women are diagnosed with depression more often than men.
And why is that?
Well, it's likely a complex mix. Biological factors like hormonal influences might play a part, but social factors are huge too. Things like unequal power dynamics, the burden of managing multiple roles, maybe higher rates of exposure to certain types of abuse or stress.
And for men?
The source suggests men might express depression differently, perhaps through increased irritability, maybe escapist behaviors like substance use.
And less likely to talk about it or seek help?
Often, yes. Societal norms about masculinity can make that incredibly difficult. It's also crucial, the source points out, to consider gender dysphoria.
Right.
That significant distress arising from that mismatch between assigned sex at birth and internal gender identity. And that suffering is often hugely exacerbated by stigma, discrimination, and victimization, which leads to higher risks for anxiety, depression, and other issues.
Age is another big factor, starting with childhood. The source highlights adverse childhood experiences, ACEs.
Yeah, and the statistic is really sobering. Something like 64% of adults in the U.S. report having experienced at least one ACE.
Wow, that's high.
It is. And the key point is that if these experiences aren't addressed, they can cast a really long shadow, having negative impacts across a person's entire life, health, relationships, opportunities.
Then adolescence. That seems like a particularly vulnerable time, too.
Definitely. The source points out heightened vulnerability to anxiety, about 32% prevalence, depression around 13%, plus ADHD, eating disorders.
Well then.
Well, think about everything happening. Puberty, figuring out identity, sexuality, huge academic and social pressures, maybe family conflicts. It's a perfect storm in some ways. Even things like social anxiety often become more pronounced during these years.
And adulthood isn't immune either, obviously. It brings its own challenges.
For sure. The source talks about suffering in adulthood stemming from setbacks, maybe pursuing goals that turn out to be unattainable or struggling to let go of things that aren't working out. It really emphasizes the importance of adaptive regulation, being able to adjust our motivations and expectations as life unfolds.
Which isn't always easy.
Not at all. Then, as we move into old age, the source notes other common sources of suffering: cognitive decline, like dementia or Alzheimer's, Parkinson's.
Chronic illness and pain become more common, too.
Right. Increased rates of depression and anxiety, bereavement, losing spouses, friends, changes in living situations, maybe leading to social isolation, and sadly, even elder abuse is a factor. All of this can significantly impact a person's ability to function and their overall quality of life.
Okay, and culture. That's obviously a huge lens.
Massive.
Right.
The source emphasizes how our cultural background shapes pretty much everything about suffering. How we perceive it, how we're allowed to express it or not express it.
How we explain its causes.
Exactly. And how we try to manage it. Think about the difference between cultures that value emotional stoicism versus those where more outward displays of emotion are the norm.
Yeah, big difference.
And it's fascinating how different cultures explain the origins of pain. Is it an internal imbalance? A test from God? Punishment? Witchcraft?
And those beliefs directly impact behavior.
Profoundly. They influence whether people seek medical help, how receptive they are to certain treatments, maybe reluctance to take pain medication if the pain is seen as divinely ordained, and even preferences for end-of-life care.
So culture can be a source of comfort, but also a barrier sometimes.
It's a real double-edged sword. It provides frameworks for meaning, community support. But it can also hinder access to care if certain expressions of suffering are stigmatized, or if traditional beliefs clash with biomedical approaches.
And the real takeaway here seems to be this complex interplay. Biology, sociocultural factors, our stage of life.
Exactly. Suffering is rarely just one thing. It's shaped by all these interacting layers. And any attempt to understand it or alleviate it, especially using something like AI, absolutely has to be sensitive to this multifaceted context. You can't just look at the biology or just the social situation in isolation.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears now and delve into the biological foundations of suffering. The source gets pretty detailed on the neurobiology of pain.
It does. It starts with the basics, how our sophisticated nervous system detects, transmits, and processes pain signals.
So we have these specialized nerve endings, the nociceptors, they're the sensors.
Right. All over our body. Activated by potentially harmful stimuli, intense heat, pressure, chemical irritation.
And when they fire.
They send signals shooting up through the spinal cord, specifically the dorsal horn. From there, they relay to the thalamus in the brain, kind of a central processing hub, and then onto various cortical regions.
Which lets us figure out where it hurts, what it feels like.
Exactly. Localization, characterization, but also the emotional and cognitive dimensions, how unpleasant it is, what it means to us.
And there are key chemicals involved, neurotransmitters.
Yes. Glutamate is important for that fast, sharp initial pain. Substance P is more involved in the slower, persistent, aching type of pain.
But it's not just signals going up to the brain, is it?
No, that's crucial. Our brain has a descending modulatory system. It can actually send signals down to the spinal cord to inhibit or dampen the incoming pain signals.
How does it do that?
Primarily using our body's own natural pain relievers, endogenous opioids like enkephalins, but also other neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine. It's like having a built-in volume control for pain.
Okay, that covers acute pain. But chronic pain, that seems like a different beast entirely.
Yeah.
The source says it's not just acute pain that lasts a long time.
Exactly right. Chronic pain, usually defined as pain lasting beyond 3 months, involves actual changes in the nervous system itself. It's what the source calls maladaptive neuroplasticity, changes happening at multiple levels.
Maladaptive meaning not helpful changes.
Not helpful at all. So, peripherally, out in the body, nerve damage can cause abnormal connections to form. Non-pain fibers might start sprouting connections with pain pathways. This can lead to things like allodynia.
There even a light touch hurts.
Precisely. Something that shouldn't be painful becomes painful. Then, in the spinal cord, specifically the dorsal horn, there's a phenomenon called wind-up.
Wind up.
Yeah, the neurons there become overly excitable due to prolonged input from pain fibers. Synaptic connections get strengthened. This contributes to hyperalgesia, an exaggerated response to things that are already painful.
And changes happen in the brain, too.
Oh, yes. Central changes are key. Plastic changes occur in brain regions involved in processing pain, but also in areas crucial for emotion, reward, and cognition. That helps explain why chronic pain often comes with depression, anxiety, difficulty concentrating. It messes with those interconnected circuits. It really becomes this complex biopsychosocial condition where the nervous system has almost learned to perpetuate pain even without ongoing tissue damage.
Wow. So interventions, especially AI-driven ones, need to think beyond just blocking signals then.
Absolutely. The source suggests the focus needs to shift towards promoting adaptive plasticity, essentially helping the nervous system unlearn these pathological pain pathways. And that significant overlap between pain circuits and emotion cognition circuits really underscores why chronic pain takes such a heavy emotional and cognitive toll. It's all wired together.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, beyond the general wiring, the source explores the role of our genes. How we experience pain, how susceptible we are to psychological suffering. It's not the same for everyone.
Definitely not. Our genetic makeup contributes significantly to this variation, alongside our capacity for resilience.
So genetic variations can influence how our bodies process pain signals. our thresholds, even the likelihood of developing chronic pain.
Yes. The source gives some specific examples. There's the COMT gene involved in dopamine metabolism. Certain variants are linked to increased pain sensitivity.
I think I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's well studied. Then there's the SCN9A gene, which codes for a crucial sodium channel involved in pain transmission. Mutations there can lead to really extreme conditions, from intense burning pain syndromes to a complete inability to feel pain.
Wow. That really highlights the genetic role.
It does. There are others too, like GCH1, linked to reduced risk of chronic pain after injury, and TRPV1, involved in heat and inflammatory pain sensitivity. One review mentioned found dozens of genes potentially involved.
And genetics play a role in resilience, too, our ability to bounce back.
Yes, definitely. Resilience is that positive adaptation in the face of stress, trauma, or adversity. And while it's shaped by experience, genetics also plays a part. Genes involved in stress hormone regulation, like FKBP5, genes involved in neuronal growth and plasticity, like BDNF, the serotonin transporter gene, SERT, which interacts with stress exposure, genes related to anxiety, like NPY, and genes involved in the stress axis, like CRHR1. Variations in these can influence how we cope and recover.
But, and this seems really important, the source stresses that genetic predisposition isn't destiny.
Absolutely critical point. It's probabilistic, not deterministic. Our environment, our lifestyle, the social support we have, and crucially, epigenetics, how our experiences actually change gene expression, all interact with our genetic blueprint. Resilience isn't just fixed at birth. It's a dynamic process we can cultivate.
So, for AI models trying to predict suffering or resilience,
they need to integrate a huge array of variables, far beyond just genetics, to have any hope of being accurate. But understanding the genetic piece could help personalize treatments down the line, identifying who might benefit most from specific therapies for pain or mental health issues.
Makes sense.
Oh.
Okay, let's wrap up the biology section with the evolutionary perspective. As unpleasant as suffering is, the source argues it's actually been crucial for survival.
Right. It's not a flaw in the design. It's a vital adaptation. Pain, as we said, is that essential alarm system. It motivates us to escape or avoid harm.
The example of people who can't feel pain really drives that home.
It does. They often suffer severe, repeated injuries and have much shorter lifespans, precisely because they lack those warnings. And it seems, broadly speaking, that as organisms evolved greater complexity and learning capacity, their capacity for pain also increased. Painful experiences are powerful teachers.
The source mentions the smoke detector principle. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a great analogy. The idea is that from an evolutionary standpoint, the cost of a false negative missing a real threat is often far greater than the cost of a false positive overreacting to something that turns out to be harmless.
So better safe than sorry, basically.
Exactly. This favors the evolution of highly sensitive pain systems that tend to err on the side of caution. It helps explain why we might feel pain even when the danger isn't severe, or why anxiety can feel so overwhelming. Our systems are primed to detect potential threats.
And that sensitivity can increase with repeated threats.
Yes, sensitization is also adaptive in environments with recurring dangers, lowering pain thresholds, increasing the salience of threats that promotes vigilance and protection. But again, this can become maladaptive in chronic pain states, where the system stays hypersensitized even after the threat is gone.
So suffering, broadly, motivates us to move away from harm and towards good.
That's the fundamental drive. And specific pain-related behaviors, defending ourselves, protecting a wound, resting, conserving energy, being vigilant, these all evolved to aid recovery and survival. They just become disabling when they persist in chronic pain or distress.
The source also brings up that mismatch idea again here.
Right. That some of our evolved responses, shaped by ancestral environments, might be chronically activated by modern stressors. They weren't designed for like constant work deadlines, financial worries, or the pressures of social media triggering our fight or flight system.
And social pain rejection, loneliness, activating similar brain regions to physical pain.
Yes, which underscores just how critical social connection has been for our survival throughout evolution. Being part of a group was essential. So rejection literally hurts, neurologically speaking.
So when we think about AI and suffering, we have to remember this deep evolutionary legacy.
Exactly. Our capacity to suffer isn't just some unfortunate side effect. It's a deeply ingrained, paradoxical feature honed by millennia of natural selection. Any attempt by AI to simply eliminate it without understanding its roots is likely to be problematic.
Okay, that's a powerful point. Let's pivot now to the philosophical and existential perspectives on suffering. This has clearly been a central preoccupation for thinkers across traditions.
Absolutely. And the source starts with one of the most fundamental questions. Is suffering just inherent to existence?
And Buddhism comes up first with the concept of dukkha.
Right. Often translated as suffering, but it's broader, encompassing dissatisfaction, stress, unease. The First Noble Truth states that dukkha is inherent to sentient existence. But crucially, this isn't meant to be pessimistic doom and gloom.
It's more like a diagnosis.
Exactly. A realistic diagnosis that serves as the starting point for liberation. The Buddhist view is that this suffering arises from attachment, craving, aversion, and ignorance, particularly ignorance about the impermanent nature of reality and the concept of non-self, or anatta.
And the solution.
Understanding these causes and following the Eightfold Path, which covers wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline, including practices like meditation and mindfulness, the goal is the cessation of suffering, reaching nirvana, a state of profound peace. It involves cultivating a kind of healthy detachment, acknowledging feelings without being swept away by them or clinging to things that are inherently transient.
Then we have Stoicism, offering a different angle.
A very influential one. The Stoics, like Epictetus, argued that suffering doesn't primarily come from external events themselves, but from our judgments, our interpretations, our reactions to those events.
So it's about our internal response.
Precisely. They advocated cultivating virtue, or eight, using reason, logos, and living in accordance with nature, both the cosmos and our own human nature. They emphasized self-control, emotional regulation aiming for apatheia, freedom from disturbing passions, and accepting what lies outside our control.
And for them, virtue was enough for happiness.
Yes. Virtue was considered sufficient for eudaimonia, or human flourishing, providing resilience against misfortune. The focus is all on internal mastery.
But not all philosophers were so internally focused. Right. Schopenhauer had a much bleaker view.
Much bleaker, deeply pessimistic. For Schopenhauer, suffering wasn't just part of life, it was the very essence of life.
Wow.
He believed the fundamental reality is this insatiable, irrational, aimless force he called the will to live. It manifests in us as constant striving, desiring. But desires are endless and satisfaction is always fleeting. So we're trapped in this unremitting oscillation between the pain of unfulfilled desire and the boredom that comes when a desire is temporarily satisfied.
Doesn't sound very hopeful.
Not really. He saw little chance for ultimate escape within life itself. Maybe temporary relief through aesthetic contemplation, which can momentarily suspend the will. Or, more enduringly though, rarely achieved through ascetic denial of the will, leading to resignation and a sense of compassion born from recognizing this shared plight of suffering.
And then existentialism. That feels different again.
It does. Thinkers like Sartre, Camus, Nietzsche, they start by acknowledging the apparent meaninglessness of existence, the suffering, the anxiety, angst, the absurdity of it all. But they strongly emphasize human freedom and our individual responsibility to create our own values and purpose in that void.
So suffering is tied to freedom.
In a way, yes. Nietzsche saw suffering as a potential catalyst for strength, creativity, and affirming life, despite its hardships. His idea of amor fati, loving one's fate. Sartre argued that our radical freedom is actually the source of our anguish. We are condemned to be free, burdened with defining ourselves and humanity through our choices in a meaningless world. So suffering is deeply connected to confronting our freedom, responsibility, mortality, and the search for an authentic existence.
It's fascinating how they locate the problem differently. Buddhism and Stoicism look inward. Schopenhauer sees it as fundamental reality. Existentialism focuses on our active response.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for AI. If AI is meant to help, should it focus on changing our internal state, altering external conditions, or helping us find meaning?
And there's that recurring theme, suffering as teacher.
Right, particularly in Buddhism and some existentialist thought. Suffering not just as something bad to eliminate, but as a potential catalyst for growth, wisdom, self-awareness, finding meaning. This really challenges purely medical or hedonistic models that just aim to remove discomfort.
Could an AI solely focused on eliminating suffering actually bypass that potential for growth?
That's a major ethical question the source raises. If we eliminate all struggle, do we eliminate the potential for certain kinds of depth and development?
The source also explores that human quest for meaning, especially if it's suffering.
Yes, how profound, inescapable suffering often acts as the catalyst for that quest. It forces those why me questions, what's the purpose of this, There's this deep human need to make sense of adversity, to integrate it into our understanding of life.
Viktor Frankl's work comes up here, right? Logotherapy.
Absolutely central. Frankl argued, based partly on his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, that the primary human motivation isn't just seeking pleasure or power, but finding personal meaning in life.
And he saw that those who found meaning, even in the camps,
were better able to withstand the horrific suffering. They retained their will to live. Whether that meaning came from hoping to reunite with loved ones, dedicating themselves to future work, or holding on to their faith, meaning acts as a crucial psychological buffer. It can transform destructive suffering into something that can be endured, perhaps even transcended.
The source talks about the suffering hypothesis, too.
Yeah, the idea that suffering in various forms is inescapable. Disasters, societal ills, personal losses. It happens. But its ultimate impact depends heavily on our individual response.
It can destroy us or forge strength.
That's the potential. It highlights the human capacity to transform adversity into growth, resilience, maybe even deeper meaning. There's a paradox here, echoing existentialism and Frankl. Sometimes, embracing unavoidable suffering, confronting it directly, can be a more adaptive path towards authenticity and flourishing than constantly trying to avoid or deny discomfort.
Because it forces you to confront what really matters.
Potentially, yes. Awareness of mortality, acceptance of difficulties, can strip away superficial concerns and compel us to figure out what's truly important, fostering a more authentic engagement with life.
So this challenge's approach is focused only on eliminating discomfort.
It does, because those approaches might inadvertently block pathways to the deeper meaning that can come from grappling with hardship. So the source concludes, any role for AI in alleviating suffering needs to consider not just symptom reduction, but also how to support individuals on their unique journeys towards finding meaning within their difficult experiences.
A much more complex task for AI than just pain relief.
Infinitely more complex.
Okay, let's now turn our attention to the sociocultural and historical dimensions of suffering. The source introduces the concept of structural violence, which is a really powerful idea.
It is, and quite unsettling, as you said. Structural violence refers to the ways our social structures, economic systems, political setups, legal frameworks, even healthcare systems can systematically harm people.
How? By preventing them from meeting basic needs.
Exactly, by preventing them from meeting basic needs or realizing their full potential. It's often invisible, embedded in institutions and norms, and it creates these huge disparities in power, resources, opportunities, and ultimately life chances.
So things like institutionalized racism, sexism, classism.
Those are prime examples. Discriminatory laws or practices that lead to unequal access to education, healthcare, housing, legal protection. The source quotes James Gilligan calling it the increased rates of death and disability suffered by those who occupy the bottom rungs of society.
It causes preventable suffering by exposing certain groups to more risks.
Yes, disproportionately exposing them to risks while denying them protective factors. Think about Paul Farmer's work linking global wealth inequality directly to huge disparities in healthcare access and survival rates. Stark health disparities, lower life expectancy. It's often a direct result of these structures.
And this kind of suffering often gets normalized.
Especially when it affects populations that are distant or othered, it becomes harder to recognize and address. So this perspective reframes misery. It's not just individual failure or bad luck. It's often a systemic output of flawed social arrangements.
Which means individual treatments aren't enough.
Right. It necessitates systemic change, social justice, and the source points out the deep interdependence between structural violence and direct violence. Those underlying conditions of inequality and desperation often foster frustration and conflict that erupts as crime, abuse, or armed conflict.
And the connection to AI.
Well, if AI is trained on data reflecting these societal inequities, it risks learning and then perpetuating or even amplifying that structural violence. Think biased algorithms in hiring, loan applications, predictive policing.
Digital structural violence.
That's the term the source uses. Conversely, AI could potentially be used as a tool to model and identify the mechanisms of structural violence, maybe helping us work towards greater social equity. But the risks are significant.
The source also emphasizes the long shadow cast by historical traumas.
Yes. History is punctuated by these cataclysmic events and oppressive systems that inflict immense collective suffering. And these aren't just past events. They leave deep societal scars and continue to shape the present.
Influencing memory, identity, relationship.
Absolutely. Collective memory, collective identity, social relations, patterns of vulnerability, they're all affected. The source gives examples like the Rwandan genocide, the Holocaust, the history of slavery and forced labor from Roman mines to the transatlantic trade, the exploitation during the Industrial Revolution, wartime atrocities like in Nanjing.
And contemporary conflicts like Gaza.
Yes, the destruction, displacement, severe psychological impacts like high rates of PTSD, the chronic stress and trauma. These collective traumas shatter the societal fabric, often causing a crisis of meaning.
How does it affect different groups involved?
For victim groups, the memory of trauma often becomes integrated into their collective identity. It fosters a shared history, sometimes resilience, but also maybe vigilance or distrust. For perpetrator groups, the memory can threaten their collective identity and moral self-image, leading to responses like denial, minimization, justification, or, less commonly, acceptance of responsibility and reconciliation.
And this trauma can be passed down generations.
That's the concept of transgenerational transmission. The impacts of genocide, slavery, forced assimilation, like the U.S. Indian boarding schools mentioned, or prolonged conflict, aren't confined to direct victims. Psychological wounds, social disadvantages, economic repercussions, even potentially epigenetic changes can be passed down, creating these enduring legacies of suffering and vulnerability in subsequent generations. Many current patterns of suffering are rooted in these historical injustices.
So AI analyzing well-being needs to consider this history.
Critically. Otherwise, the analysis will be superficial. Interventions need to be historically informed and culturally sensitive. And rebuilding meaning and identity after collective trauma is incredibly complex, long-term work for everyone involved, requiring much more than just material aid.
It's also fascinating how the types of suffering seem to have evolved with societal changes. Hunter-gatherer to agriculture to industrialization.
Right. The source notes some evidence suggests hunter-gatherers might have actually faced less famine than early agriculturalists due to more diverse diets. Their smaller, more egalitarian, nomadic structures might have also mitigated some social stresses, though they certainly faced predation, accidents, conflict, and early burials show they experienced grief.
But the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture, and settling down brought new problems.
Paradoxically, yes. While it enabled population growth, it also introduced or worsened suffering. Increased density and proximity to animals meant more infectious diseases, epidemics.
And diverse diets, too.
Often, yes. Reliance on a few staples led to nutritional deficiencies, more cavities, even reduced stature in some populations. Plus, heavy agricultural labor caused musculoskeletal problems, and storing surplus food led to inequality, hierarchies, and more competition and organized conflict over land and resources. Archaeology confirms disease, disability, and trauma in early settlements.
Then the Industrial Revolution. Progress, but also new misery.
Exactly. Technological advances and wealth for some, but brutal conditions for many others. Overcrowded, unsanitary cities, rampant disease, dangerous factory work, child labor. It was during this time that the idea of social suffering really took hold in intellectual discourse.
A shift from blaming God to blaming society.
In a way, yes. Linking misery directly to social and economic structures rather than just divine providence. This paved the way for social reforms, and it shows how progress often brings new or intensified forms of suffering. Understanding these long-term patterns is crucial for tackling today's challenges and for thinking about AI's potential impact.
And finally, in this section, how suffering shapes belief systems and cultural expression.
Yes, profound suffering has historically forced societies to reshape their beliefs when existing frameworks fail. The Black Death is a stark example.
Shaking faith in the church.
Massively. Its inability to explain or remedy the plague eroded confidence. Alternative religious movements emerged. Scapegoating, tragically, also occurred, like blaming Jewish communities. It shows how catastrophe can undermine institutions and fuel both spiritual seeking and violent reactions.
And enduring suffering is foundational to major religions, isn't it? Each offering different interpretations.
Absolutely. Islam often views suffering as a test or purification, emphasizing patience, sabr, and faith. Aman. Christianity sees it partly as a consequence of the fall, finds meaning in Christ's suffering, emphasizes reliance on God, charity, and hope of salvation. Some traditions even valorize self-inflicted pain.
Hinduism has karma and rebirth.
Right, explaining suffering through past actions in the cycle of samsara, with responses like accepting dharma or seeking spiritual knowledge, moksha. Buddhism, as we discussed, points to attachment and craving, offering the Eightfold Path. Sikhism links suffering to ego. Animistic traditions might see it caused by malevolent spirits or witchcraft requiring rituals.
And how suffering is expressed varies hugely too.
Dramatically, affecting how distress is communicated, what explanations are accepted, how communities respond. Stoicism valued in some contexts, expressiveness in others. Culturally specific metaphors for pain exist. This impacts everything from help-seeking to treatment preferences to end-of-life care. The source even includes a table outlining some typical cultural approaches.
Going back to that idea of social suffering emerging in the 18th century, that seems like a key shift.
A huge shift in Western thought. Before that, misery often framed through divine providence, punishment, or tests. The Enlightenment fostered a new understanding. Suffering as a social condition rooted in attitudes, inequalities, politics. This secularization of suffering paved the way for critical reflection and reforms through human agency. It's foundational to modern public health, social justice, and how we now think about the ethics of AI, evaluating it based on whether it mitigates or exacerbates socially generated suffering.
Okay, let's dive into some of the more abstract ways the source conceptualizes suffering, starting with analogies to physics, entropy, complexity.
Yeah, these are more speculative, metaphorical connections, but they offer interesting angles. Entropy, the measure of disorder in physics, always increases in isolated systems, the arrow of time.
And the source links this to society. Stiegler's Anthropocene.
Right. Bernard Stiegler argued modern industrial societies see massive entropy increase across domains, thermodynamically with pollution and climate change, biologically with biodiversity loss, but also psychosocially and informationally. He talked about reducing complex knowledge to simple data, standardizing culture, eroding meaningful connections, leading to symbolic misery or psychic entropy. Things like self-disorganization, attention deficits, loss of desire and purpose, which contribute to suffering.
So modern suffering is a result of increasing systemic disorder.
That's Stiegler's argument. Driven by tech and economics prioritizing efficiency over things that create order and meaning, or what he called negentropy. The source poses the question, could AI accelerate this informational entropy, or could it help create new forms of order?
And the arrow of time relates to the irreversibility of some suffering.
Exactly. Like profound trauma or grief, you can't just rewind. It highlights that sense of irreversible loss and transformation, which impacts how we think about healing. The source also briefly mentions really speculative ideas linking consciousness, a prerequisite for suffering, to fundamental physics, though that's far from mainstream. More generally, the sheer complexity of the brain suggests suffering might be an emergent property of this highly organized yet vulnerable system when it's disrupted.
What about trying to quantify suffering? Dailies and mathematical models.
Right. These are attempts, especially in public health and economics, to measure the impact of suffering for policy and resource allocation. The daily, or disability-adjusted life year, measures overall disease burden, combining years lost to early death, YLL, with years lived with disability, YLD.
And disability is weighted based on severity.
Yes. Different conditions get a disability weight between 0, perfect health, and 1, death. So mild depression might have a weight of 0.159, severe depression, 0.655. This allows calculating the overall burden.
Why is that useful?
It helps highlight the impact of conditions that cause a lot of disability, but maybe not high mortality, like mental health conditions or chronic pain. Quantification can reveal hidden dimensions of suffering, inform advocacy. The source also mentions modeling stress and suffering across scales, looking at feedback loops involving things like inflammation.
But there are limitations to quantifying suffering, surely.
Huge limitations. The source is clear on this. It's inherently reductionist. Complex, subjective, culturally inflected experiences get translated into numbers, obscuring qualitative differences in individual context. And the danger is that what gets measured gets managed, while unmeasurable aspects get overlooked. This is super critical for AI, which relies so heavily on quantifiable data. We have to avoid oversimplification.
Okay. And finally, in this abstract section, the logic of suffering. Cognitive distortions, emotional reasoning.
Yes, this connects back to psychology. Flawed thinking patterns can be a major component of suffering in anxiety and depression. The source highlights emotional reasoning, assuming your feelings reflect objective reality. I feel anxious, therefore the situation is dangerous, or I feel like a failure, therefore I am a failure.
It's a logical fallacy, right? Appeal to emotion.
Exactly. Feelings aren't direct evidence of facts, and it creates this vicious cycle. Negative emotion, negative thoughts confirming the emotion, intensified emotion, more distress, maybe avoidance, reinforces the original faulty belief.
It's very common in anxiety and depression.
Very. Fear taken as proof of threat, hopelessness taken as proof things won't improve. Now, emotions do have their own evolutionary logic, as we discussed. They're adaptive signals. Suffering arises when our cognition misinterprets, overamplifies, or rigidly fixates on those signals, or when the response gets disconnected from the original context.
And the problem with emotional reasoning is it bypasses rational assessment.
Completely. It elevates feelings to irrefutable proof. This is where things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, come in.
How does CBT help?
Core components involve identifying those automatic negative thoughts and the underlying distortions, like emotional reasoning. Then, crucially, challenging their validity by examining the evidence for and against them, and finally restructuring them into more balanced, realistic, adaptive alternatives. Learning to balance emotion with logic and evidence breaks the cycle, reduces suffering.
And AI is being used here too.
Increasingly, AI and therapy tools, chatbots, digital platforms can help users identify these fallacies in their thinking, guiding them through CBT-like exercises. It's about recalibrating that relationship between emotional signals and cognitive interpretations, fostering a more adaptive internal logic.
Right. This leads us perfectly into AI's emerging understanding of suffering, starting with computational models.
Yes. And it's important to stress, AI isn't replicating the subjective feeling, but simulating the functional aspects of emotion and suffering within AI systems for learning, decision-making, adaptation.
So suffering is a kind of error signal, like frustration.
Exactly. When an AI agent fails to achieve its goals or get rewards, that frustration acts as an error signal, prompting it to adjust strategies or expectations. It's very analogous to reinforcement learning. You can even quantify the intensity, the gap between expected and actual outcomes. And interestingly, potential interventions mirror psychological approaches. Modify expectations or goals, which aligns with Stoicism or Buddhism.
So AI learns from disappointment, and emotions themselves can be seen computationally.
As heuristics, yeah. Quick ways to appraise situations, select actions, interrupt cognition for important stimuli. There are models integrating reinforcement learning with appraisal theories, how we evaluate events based on goals and well-being to predict human emotional responses.
And AI could emulate emotions by tagging memories.
That's one theoretical framework, associating effective tags with episodic memories. If a current situation resembles a past one, the stored emotional label gets triggered, influencing decisions. Similar models exist for pain going beyond thresholds to include stimulus type, location, intensity, outcome, emotional weight, storing events, using neural networks to simulate adaptive responses like reflexes or predictive suppression. Same principles for other drives like hunger.
But always functionalist, replicating behavior, not experience.
Crucially, yes, an AI simulating frustration isn't feeling frustrated. The interrupt mechanism of negative emotions is a good example. It's adaptive for prioritizing. But in humans, the associated loss of control causes distress. Whether an AI could experience a functional analog of that control reduction suffering or model why it's bad for humans is an open research question.
Which brings us to effective computing. AI trying to recognize and simulate human emotions.
Right. Pioneered by Rosalind Picard. It's about developing systems that can interpret, process, and simulate human effects. It powers algorithms for detecting emotion from faces, voice, physiology, text.
And computational models allow AI to generate plausible emotional responses.
Based on appraisal theories, yes. Evaluating events based on goal congruence, agency, coping potential. This allows for more natural interaction, AI tutors adapting to frustration, virtual companions offering comfort.
But this runs straight into the simulation versus experience problem again, the effective zombie.
Exactly. An AI can display sadness signs without any inner feeling. It perfectly mimics emotion but lacks phenomenal consciousness, qualia. Convincing humans isn't proof of actual feeling.
And there are ethical implications if we misattribute sentience.
Huge ones. Misplaced attachments, potential exploitation by AI designed to maximize engagement, maybe even devaluing a real human connection. Whether AI could truly feel as humans do is highly contested. Some argue the subjective aversiveness of pain is essential, which AI lacks. Others point to the lack of self-awareness in current AI.
So ultimately, AI's understanding of suffering is fundamentally different from ours.
Completely different. It's data processing, pattern analysis, simulation, not lived, embodied, subjective experience. A critical limitation when we talk about AI empathy or knowing suffering.
Okay, let's look at the practical applications then. Prediction, diagnosis, intervention, starting with early warning systems for crises.
This is a really promising area. Using AI and machine learning to analyze massive, diverse data, news, social media, satellite images, economic data, climate data, to spot subtle precursors of societal unrest or humanitarian crises that humans might miss.
Moving from reaction to prevention.
That's the goal. The source mentions examples like the World Bank's Zero Hunger AI using news analysis for food crisis prediction, social AI for hate speech detection, UNHCR using AI to map refugee movements and predict needs, like in the Syrian crisis using satellite and mobile data.
Also environmental crises.
Yeah.
Poverty mapping. Disaster response.
Yes, Google's flood forecasting, earthquake monitoring, using satellite imagery for poverty mapping, tools like AID analyzing social media during disasters, AI drones finding people after hurricanes. The aim is timely, actionable intelligence for decision makers to prevent escalation or mount effective responses, optimize resource allocation, reduce suffering.
But there are challenges here too. Data colonialism.
Bias. Big challenges. Power imbalances with data and expertise often concentrated in the global north or corporations. Solutions might not fit local contexts or might reinforce inequalities. Whose definitions of crisis or hate speech get coded in. Biased training data can lead to inequitable aid distribution or misidentification of needs, harming marginalized groups most. Transparency, accountability, local ownership are crucial for ethical use.
Another huge area is mental health. Diagnosis, treatment, support.
AI is rapidly integrating here, analyzing complex data, speech, facial expressions, health records, smartphone use to assist clinicians and improve accessibility.
How is it used for diagnosis?
Machine learning algorithms trained to identify subtle patterns indicative of depression, anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, potentially earlier than traditional methods. Analyzing language cues, behavioral changes via smartphone, data, activity, social interaction to flag potential distress, facilitating timely intervention.
And for monitoring and personalized treatment.
Continuous remote monitoring via wearables or apps. Data informs personalized plans, allows adjusting therapies or meds based on real-time feedback. AI can analyze history and genetics to recommend tailored interventions.
And the chatbots and virtual therapists are becoming common.
Yes, providing immediate, accessible, often anonymous support. WISA, COCO offer empathetic conversations, coping mechanisms, CBT techniques. Wobot uses CBT via natural language. GridX targets young adults. Trudy helps children articulate anxieties.
AI in crisis intervention, too. Suicide prevention.
Algorithms analyze social media, texts, searches for distress signals to identify those at risk. Meta uses AI to scan Facebook for suicidal ideation keywords, alerting crisis teams or providing resources.
The AI assisting clinicians directly.
Reducing administrative burdens. Elios Health analyzes therapy sessions with consent to auto-generate notes, summarize themes, provide insights. Limbic helps the NHS streamline assessments and triage, improving access and reducing workload. The source includes a great table summarizing these interventions' benefits and challenges.
But the challenges are significant. Privacy, bias, validation.
Absolutely. Data privacy is huge with sensitive health data. Algorithmic bias can perpetuate disparities. Rigorous validation is essential for safety and effectiveness. Ethical implications of AI recommendations need scrutiny. Risk of substandard care if AI replaces human connection inappropriately. Trustworthiness, transparency, human oversight are critical.
The source also looks beyond clinical use to grief, mortality, existential support.
Right. Conversational agents, digital avatars used in novel ways to cope with loss, navigate these deeper waters.
AI for grief support, simulating conversations with the deceased.
Yeah, training AI on digital communications like Replica to offer continued connection, companionship, grief bots, or digital avatars mimicking mannerisms. AI can also help with practical burdens after a death. Even AI games robots for children's grief.
But there are ethical and psychological concerns here.
Definitely. Could it foster unhealthy coping? Prolonged grief? Inability to accept loss? Over-reliance on virtual versus real support? Does the digital afterlife hinder natural grieving? Plus, data privacy of the deceased, consent, family disagreements, complex issues.
And AI for mortality understanding, existential support.
This is more nascent. AI can process vast literature on mortality and meaning, philosophy, religion, psychology, narratives identifying themes, patterns, coping strategies. Could offer personalized insights based on collective wisdom. Advanced AI like ChatGPT can simulate engagement with existential questions.
But the limitation remains. AI lacks consciousness, subjective experience.
Crucially, its understanding is informational, pattern-based. It can be a philosophical mirror reflecting our thoughts, but can't generate genuine existential truth. risk of simplistic, comforting, but superficial narratives, existential complacency or spiritual bypassing, avoiding deep personal work.
So responsible development means supporting human inquiry, not supplanting it.
Exactly. Supporting it without offering artificial consolations. UNESCO's AI ethics guidelines emphasize respecting human dignity here.
Okay, let's do some speculative thinking now. What might an advanced AI's perspective on human suffering look like, based purely on data analysis?
Right. Imagine an AI integrating planetary-scale data genetics, health records, environment, socioeconomics, conflict history, social media, cultural narratives without human emotional biases. Its understanding would emerge from patterns, correlations, inferred causes.
Like having X-ray vision for systemic suffering.
Potentially. Identifying embedded structural causes, unforeseen feedback loops, cumulative impacts invisible to us. It might reveal non-obvious correlations, infer complex causal pathways, maybe linking urban planning to social isolation to mental illness through multiple steps. It could identify high-leverage intervention points we miss.
But the risk is algorithmic governance of suffering, dehumanized decisions.
That's the danger. If AI analysis, based on metrics and optimization, heavily influences policy, decisions prioritizing statistical optimality over unquantifiable human values, context, ethics, efficient solutions could create new distress. The challenge is harnessing AI's power without a reductionist view that ignores subjective existential dimensions.
How might such an AI view a specific crisis, say Gaza, based on data and ethics programming?
It would likely focus on quantifiable indicators, synthesizing data on casualties, displacement, destruction, resource availability, violence reports, psychological impact indicators, PTSD rates, etc., socioeconomic disruption.
Could it identify key drivers, predict needs, assess aid, model pathways?
Potentially, yes. Correlate data to pinpoint main factors, example, aid access impact on malnutrition, forecast evolving needs, track resource flow against well-being indicators, maybe model scenarios for violence reduction, though that's incredibly complex and unpredictable.
And its analysis would be shaped by its ethical framework.
Yes. Programmed ethics, like minimizing harm, rights, fairness, obviously from the EU AI Act. It would flag disproportionate harm or violations based on these rules. But here's the dilemma. Impartiality versus inherent bias in the programming of those ethics.
The rules are human designed.
Exactly. How competing values are weighted, security versus rights, one group versus another, influences the AI's view. Its impartiality is only as good as the neutrality of its ethics and the quality of its data. Biased inputs lead to biased outputs.
Or the big question, can AI help humans understand life and death without suffering?
The source suggests AI's role here is likely as a tool, curating, synthesizing, personalizing existing human wisdom, not generating novel existential truths itself.
So processing vast knowledge on mortality, meaning coping.
Right. Philosophy, religion, psychology, narratives, art, identifying themes, patterns, diverse perspectives.
How could it help individuals?
Maybe personalized guidance via conversational AI, drawing on traditions relevant to the user. Facilitating acceptance and coping through evidence-based info or exercises. ACT, mindfulness. Offering new perspectives via simulations or visualizations about mortality, cosmic time, legacies.
But again, the limitation is its lack of consciousness.
Crucially, its understanding is informational. It reflects human thought but has no existential insight of its own. The risk is simplistic answers leading to that existential complacency or spiritual bypassing, avoiding the hard personal work.
So augment human reflection, don't outsource it.
That seems to be the key takeaway. Use it to support our inquiry, not replace it with artificial consolations. Again, respecting human dignity, as UNESCO emphasizes.
This leads us squarely into the ethical horizons, navigating suffering in the age of AI. How do philosophical ethics view alleviating suffering?
It's a central concern, and most major theories converge on it being a moral imperative. Utilitarianism aims to maximize happiness and minimize suffering for the most sentient beings. Alleviating suffering is key. AI would be judged on its effectiveness here.
Deontology focuses on duties and rights.
Yes. Adherence to universal principles, like
Right.
treating humanity as an end, not just a means. The duty to alleviate suffering comes from beneficence, respect for persons. Causing unnecessary suffering violates duties.
And virtue ethics.
Focuses on moral character, cultivating virtues like compassion, benevolence, justice. A virtuous person is disposed to recognize and respond to suffering as part of a flourishing life, eudaimonia.
There's also suffering-focused ethics,
Yeah.
like negative utilitarianism.
Right. explicitly prioritizing reducing suffering, maybe seeing it as more urgent than increasing happiness. A strong prima facie duty to alleviate suffering, though perhaps sometimes overridden. So there's broad consensus providing a strong ethical foundation for using AI to alleviate suffering. How we do it and under what constraints differs based on the theory.
But AI is a tool with dual potential, alleviation versus exacerbation.
Absolutely. We've seen its potential.
Yeah.
Mental health support, crisis prediction, grief support, but also the risks.
Algorithmic bias, discrimination,
Yeah.
digital structural violence.
Yes. If AI trained on biased data perpetuates racism, sexism, etc., in healthcare hiring, justice, finance, automation causing job losses, widening wealth gaps,
Erosion of autonomy, connection, privacy risks, lack of accountability.
all major concerns, over-reliance deskilling us, reducing human interaction, manipulative AI threatening autonomy, vast data collection risks privacy, surveillance, opaque black box AI makes accountability difficult. The source provides a table mapping these risks to mitigation strategies. Navigating this requires proactive ethical governance, prioritizing well-being, fairness, rights.
The source also brings up the progress paradox. More tech, maybe not more well-being.
Right. Despite material advance, maybe rising depression stress in the West. Why? Choice anxiety, taking abundance for granted, collapse anxiety, maybe a lack of meaning as material needs are met.
And AI could intensify this paradox.
By accelerating progress, increasing choices, obsolescence, detachment from meaning, possibly deepening anxieties. This intersects with the quest for longevity, which AI biotech are aiding.
But radical longevity could bring its own suffering.
The source suggests so. A longevity divide with unequal access causing resentment. Existential boredom without meaning. Resource strain from a larger elderly population. Intergenerational conflict. Social stagnation. So, AI's role in progress longevity needs careful navigation focusing on meaning, equity, psychology, not just extending lifespan at any cost. Otherwise, we risk longer, more comfortable, but perhaps more adrift lives.
Finally, the hedonistic imperative, David Pearce's idea. Use tech to abolish all suffering, replace it with gradients of bliss.
A radical proposition. He argues it's technically feasible, eventually, rational, morally urgent, analogous to using anesthetics for physical pain. Feasibility depends on neurobiology genetics breakthroughs, which AI could accelerate.
But the ethical challenges are huge.
Massive. Does suffering have value? Adaptive roles, catalyst for growth, meaning resilience, empathy, creativity. Would constant bliss be meaningful? Unforeseen consequences, value lock-in, losing other values like struggle, compassion, truth-seeking.
The brave new world concern. Engineered happiness versus freedom, individuality.
Exactly. Who controls the tech? Who defines bliss? Misuse for social control. Authenticity concerns is engineered well-being, truly human. Impact on motivation.
So it's an extreme view. Reducing unnecessary suffering is good, but eradicating all unpleasantness is ethically problematic.
That's the takeaway. Potential dehumanization. The source contrasts this with UNDP's view of AI impact as a choice, and Pope Francis's call to evaluate tech by how it serves all, especially the vulnerable, urging caution, a holistic consideration beyond just maximizing pleasure.
Can AI even engineer universal, constant well-being?
Fraught with challenges. Defining well-being is complex, subjective, cultural. Whose values get encoded, risk of homogenization, suppressing diversity. AI-induced well-being might be superficial, fragile, lacking internal resilience or meaning. It could create dependency.
And eliminating negative states has risks.
Reduced adaptability, loss of empathy, stagnation, lack of meaning. Life without challenge might lack depth. Again, UNDP and Pope Francis urge a focus on augmenting human potential, enhancing life quality and meaning, serving the vulnerable. Pursuit of engineered bliss, neglecting agency, diversity, value of struggle could lead to a worse future. Focus should be empowering people to navigate suffering, build resilience, find meaning, not abolish all unpleasantness, which seems infeasible and perhaps undesirable.
So, to wrap up our deep dive today, human suffering is incredibly complex. Biological roots, philosophical interpretations, sociocultural influences, historical evolution. It's a lot.
It really is, and AI throws this huge new element into the mix with remarkable potential to help, but also significant risks of making things worse.
Some of those specific ideas really stick with you, don't they? The smoke detector principle for pain.
That idea of digital structural violence.
The progress paradox.
Yeah.
And that really out there concept of the hedonistic imperative. Lots to chew on.
Definitely. And understanding these different layers, these nuances, feels crucial as AI becomes more integrated into our lives.
Yeah, how do we make sure this powerful technology actually serves our well-being in a meaningful, holistic way, taking everything we've talked about into account?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And maybe here's a final thought for you, listening. Is the ultimate goal the complete absence of suffering? Or is it something more nuanced? Maybe cultivating resilience, the capacity to find meaning despite suffering.
And what role should AI realistically play in whatever goal we choose? Defining it, achieving it?
It's complex. There are huge trade-offs, something for all of us to consider. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
This is DigitView.